So now starts the binding process, and be real honest, the binding is a stressful, it's a stressful challenge to me. Everything up to this point has been pretty straightforward. You use templates to cut out your sides and your top and your back, and you cut braces and you carve the braces and you glue the braces down. There's not, I mean, of course you can make mistakes during that, but it's pretty straightforward. You know, you follow the basic fundamentals, use the right tools, and you use the jigs that you have. You know, bending the sides is not nearly as difficult as it sounds, as long as you've got a bending jig, a heating blanket, and you move slow, take your time. So then you get to the binding, and you're gonna cut a channel in here. You're gonna take a router and you're gonna run it around your guitar, and you're gonna cut into the sides. And if you're not careful, you can cut the top off of the guitar, and all the work you've done is gone away. And you've got to be real precise in cutting this channel, that it's the right depth, that it's the right thickness. A couple years ago, about a year ago, I tried to build a mandolin, and I got careless and I let my router, my binding was this thick, and I messed around and cut a channel that was that thick. And there was no way to correct that. You know, I just got careless and I wasn't paying close attention. So I had to take a big strip of maple and make a piece of binding, and it looked bad. It looked terrible. And the whole mandolin project turned out to be a disaster. But my point is, you don't want to make those mistakes when you're binding. So this is the first time, in my opinion, in the process that you really, you get to a point where you gotta be right. But before I start doing that, the first thing I'm gonna do, I'm gonna sand these sides. I think when I bent the sides, you know, I sprayed water on here, and I think that water stained this a little bit, because the back looks really good. And I, of course, didn't have to spray any water on the back, but the sides need a lot of work. So I'm gonna sand the sides first. And the reason I wanna sand them before I do the binding is because the binding is thin, and once you get the binding on here, if then you start doing your initial sanding, you run the risk of sanding your bindings down too thin. So I'm gonna start sanding, which again, as I've said before, you do just a hell of a lot of sanding when you build a guitar. And I'm gonna sand, probably gonna take quite a bit of sanding. I'm gonna start with some fairly aggressive grit and then work my way down to probably 220. So then we'll cut the channels and start the binding. I'm not gonna spend a lot of time videoing this because we all know how to sand something, but the challenge I have is I don't have a vacuum press, and I think that might be in the cards one day, but you need a way to hold the guitar down. So I just use a wood screw clamp, and I don't hammer down too tight on it, and then I just clamp it down to hold it in place. Then I'm going to take from a spindle sander some sanding paper, and well, now it is time to start the binding process. And what I'm going to do is I use this cradle, this router, a little trim router, sits down in here. Your guitar is also set in a cradle, and then you will raise this up, slide the guitar under it, drop it down, and route your channel. And the reason you're using a cradle here is this router bit is the stand that this would be mounted to if it weren't on this. So imagine that stand is right here, and as long as you have a flat, as long as the router bit is 90 degrees to the side, you're going to get a good 90-degree cut. However, we know that the top is slightly arched and the back has a very prominent arch on it. So if we were doing the back right now, and just using the router handheld, it would be tilted like that because of the arch, and you would not be cutting a 90-degree channel, or in woodworking terms, a rabbet. And it's important that you get that 90 degrees. So the way you do that is you have your cradle here. I took just a straight edge, I put a mark on it, and then I come around all sides and I measure and make sure they're the same height. And like right here, it's not, so I need to adjust that. And there's little wheels underneath that you can adjust. Here's the binding. It's ebony binding. And then here is black, white, black purfling that I'm going to use. The first thing that you have to determine after you've established the level, the height on the guitar in the cradle, that's level. The next thing is you need to know how deep are you going to plow into the guitar with your to set your binding and your purfling. So right here I have my bearings that you use with the straight cut router bit, and I've got them aligned from the smallest bearing to the largest. And I've done some test fittings here, and the second one, place that on there. And hopefully you can see this. Place the binding and the purfling. I don't know if I'm gonna be able to. There we go, maybe you can see that. And you can see there's the knife blade right there. It's going to cut it just deep enough to put those two in there. So the first cut that I'll make is with this bearing. Then I will come back and I will need a larger bearing, because then I'll have to cut the channel. It's a two-step channel for the binding. And as you can see, that would cut way, way, way too deep. So we're going to put the little set screw on here. Give that a good tighten and put it in the router, and then we have to adjust the depth of how deep into the guitar we're going to cut. So that comes next. Now that you have the bearing, the correct bearing on the router bit, now then you need to set the depth. And you can see there's the knife blade right there. And of course, that's the bearing that'll run against the side of the guitar. And this is the black, white, black purfling. And what you want is to set the depth, which I've already done, and I've done a couple of test cuts also. I've done several test cuts. Is you want the knife blade to cut just a tiny bit shallower than the purfling. And I need to go back in there and double check that. That does look like it's too shallow. I'm gonna go back and double check it. But the whole idea is you want that to be just cut a channel just deep enough that it leaves just a little bit of the purfling above the side so you can sand and scrape down flush. So I'm gonna check that depth one last time, do one more test cut, and then we'll start cutting. So we're getting ready to cut the channel for the purfling and the binding. And the first cut, you're gonna make two cuts. It's a step channel. The first cut is going to be the thickness of these two pieces together. That thickness and that depth. Because the idea is you want to cut deep enough or far enough into the guitar that these two will go in there and sit flush. Then the second one you cut is going to be that thickness. And of course, that will give you your 2 steps, the top step for the purfling and the bottom step for the binding. I've also marked the direction that I want to start this. When you're cutting, a router bit turns this way. And you would normally push it into the router bit. But because of this grain, see how straight this grain is? If that router bit's coming and catches this just right, it could break that off. So you start with what's called a climb cut. That's when you're gonna cut in the same direction the bit is spinning. And when you do that, you have to hang on pretty tight. You always hold on to the guitar or anything you're cutting with a router tight. But when you're doing a climb cut, it will want to pull it through real fast. So I'm going to cut those. That one first is a climb cut. Then I'll come here and do the same thing. Follow those lines. Same here. Start at this lower bout, cut up to the middle, and then come around here. And when I finish that, I'll turn around and do I guess that's called a push cut, where I'll cut into the router blade. So here we go. See, that's what I'm talking about. Son of a bitch. This is what I was talking about when I said that this is such a challenging cut. And it did exactly what I was trying to prevent happening. It caught this grain and broke it out. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to get a piece here. I'm going to try to cut this out, patch it in there. Then I'll have to sand it down to the same thickness as this. And then I'll need to come in and cut that channel. So, time to fix my mistakes. So I'm going to take a knife and I'll just slowly carve this out. All right, trying to recover from this. I got my blood pressure down a little bit. Took a deep breath. I came in here, I used the knife. I took a chisel and I cut as close to up and down as I could right there. Across there. I found a piece of spruce from the same top that the grain is somewhat close. That's the tightest I could get. I took some probably 100 grit, 150 grit paper and made sure I sanded up this way and sanded that way to try and get the walls square. When I would put this little piece in here, the only way it would sit flush is if I tilted it up. So I took it to my sander, my disc sander, and I cut just a tiny little bevel, or sanded a little bevel on it. Sorry about how shaky this is. Normally I can do everything set up. So you can see, pretty good fit, pretty good. So I'm gonna super glue this in, sand it down. I don't know what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna super glue it in first and then figure out what in the hell to do next. All right, there's the patch. What a mess. I'm going to we'll start sanding now, see if we can make it disappear. Well, that's the best I could do. I wish I could have tightened that up right there. I thought I had it real nice and tight, but it's gonna be so close to the binding, you may have to really look for it to find it. But you know, you make mistakes and you do what you can, try and fix them. And every now and then someone will ask me if I ever sell my guitars. I've tried to sell them, and this is the reason I would never try to sell a guitar. My skill levels aren't there yet. I follow a guy on YouTube who's if you're not watching Driftwood Guitars, you really should. His name is, I think it's Chris Alvarez, and he said that he built, I believe he said 40 guitars before he really felt like he had built the perfect guitar. So this is number 7, but I've actually built probably 3 or 4 more that didn't come together. So I've attempted to build about 10 guitars, so I've still got a long way to go based on Chris's history. So, all right, next thing I'm gonna do, I'm gonna come in here before I cut the step channel. I'm gonna take a block with some sandpaper. I'm gonna smooth all of this out. Now that I've gotten through that disaster, back to working on the channel. So I have a little sanding block here, some 150 grit paper glued to a square piece, and I've gone around the entire guitar. Try to make sure I've got a good channel here, a good rabbit. There's also, it always creates fuzzies, so I'm going to try to knock these off now before we'll do the glue up. Because this grain runs so straight and it's a soft wood, that router hits it, it creates little fuzz on the ends. I went ahead and cut the back channel. I've got the two-step channel on the top. There's a good view of it for the binding and the purfling. So now I'm going to go ahead and glue up and tape the binding and purfling. And I'm going to tell you, I'm so glad that part is over. Holy shit, that cutting these channels just make me a nervous wreck. And if you've watched the video earlier, you see why it makes me a nervous wreck. You have two channels here, so you got to make sure you get glue in both of them. I'm trying to level the binding, and this is the smallest block plane I have. I've got a little finger plane, but it just doesn't seem like it wants to work. So, and of course, you can't get down into here with this because it's not flush. I'm not really sure what's happening here. When I cut the channels and I put this little piece of the binding in it, it fits just right. There's just a tad of overhang right here. But when I come around, all of a sudden my channel is not nearly as deep right here, and it gets shallow across here. And I don't understand that, and it's happened on several of my guitars in the past. I don't know why. You know, it's got a bearing. There's a router bit with a bearing that's riding right here on the side, and nothing changes from here to here. So I don't know why the channel is shallower here. So what I'm going to do is take a rasp. I'm going to very carefully try and give myself a little bit more, try to cut a little deeper in here, and it's especially right here on the upper bout as it comes around. Hope I'm not going to screw this up. I've got one side of the binding taped on, and I need to now trim this. I'm going to trim it just a little long, but the way I'm going to do that is using this little, I made a little miter slot, a miter saw gauge, I'm not sure what you call it, but it will allow me to cut a straight cut. The binding is taped. I'm going to remove it now and then sand everything smooth, get it nice and clean, set it aside, and begin the next step. You know, there's a million different tools that are specialty tools for luthiers, and a lot of them are really expensive. And one of the very best tools, though, is a razor blade. It is an indispensable tool for any shop. So when I glued this down, I sanded it, and this binding, this ebony, the dust gets mixed in with while it's sanding into the maple, and it scars it up really bad, leaves it really ugly. And I don't want to sand it anymore because it's just going to make it worse. So you take a razor blade, and it's tedious, it's slow, but it cleans it right up. It's a must-have. So I've got the binding glued in on the back of the guitar, but of course it's a little proud, so I need to get it flush to the sides. And I'm going to use a card scraper. I took and put a nice edge on it. So I'll slowly work this down until I get it flush. I don't think you can really see it in the video, but I've got a tiny little gap right here where the binding didn't butt up real tight with the body. So there's a way you can kind of cheat on this to fill that gap. Take some sanding paper and sand some of that ebony. Get it down into that little space, and take a pipette with some thin viscosity super glue. Let it dry, come back and sand it, and it does a pretty good job of filling it. Ever since this wood showed up at my house, I don't know, 3 months ago, I have been so looking forward to see how is it going to look with that beautiful curly maple. It's almost a three-dimensional look. How's that going to contrast with this black ebony binding? And I just think it looks really, really good. So I've got the box completed. I've sanded it. There's still a few areas, like right here, where I'm going to come in with a razor blade. You know, this maple shows squeeze out way more. It's way more visible than on rosewood. So I've got to clean that up. But for the most part, it's done, and I'm going to start on the neck next. I hope you're enjoying these, and if you would, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe, and that way, as I post updates, you'll get a notification and you can keep up with the build on this beautiful guitar. Thank you, guys.